I'm not where I'm supposed to be. I'm going
Hey,
in
I'm Danielle
circles,
Davies, and you're
going
listening to
in
Roar, a
circles.
show that
I
amplifies
should
the
get
voices of women
away
breaking
from
barriers, leading
here.
change, and
There's a
making real
better
impact.
place for me,
Keep listening for bold
better
ideas and
place for
stories that
me.
inspire you to
Trying to
find your
play my
voice and make some
symphony,
noise.
but there's so much.
Hello, and welcome to the Roar Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Davies, and today we're speaking with Caitlin Tivy, the founder of Tivy Consulting. Caitlin provides clinical consulting and medical writing for women's and LGBTQ plus health tech. She's also a pelvic health physical therapist. Caitlin and I connected several months ago in the copywriting space, but what really has stood out to me are her extremely well-researched posts on LinkedIn where she writes a lot about the challenges of women's healthcare. I will link to some of those posts in the show notes. But for now, we're here to talk about what she does, how she does it, and how it impacts women's health. Welcome to Roar, Caitlin.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Danielle. Excited to be
Thank
here.
you for being here. I'm really excited because every one of your posts motivates me in a different way, and they are so well thought out. In fact, prior to us talking, we had sent an email back
Yeah.
and forth because I was like, you know so much information that I don't even know how to focus this. So bear with us. We're trying to focus it,
Totally.
but we could diverge because Caitlin is really like a research queen. So, but before we go any further, would you mind giving us some background on what you do as a pelvic health physical therapist? And also, if you don't mind, letting us know what came first, the physical therapy or the writing aspect of it?
Yeah, great question. And it is complicated to explain what I do sometimes because I wear so many different hats. But I started off in a mix of clinical and research work. So I initially thought in my career that I wanted to go into biomedical research and spent a couple years at the NIH doing very traditional bench lab research and got really into data and numbers there. That's when I decided that being a bench scientist wasn't the right fit for me and ended up moving into the physical therapy world from there because it really combined my interests in science and data with real world actionable steps to help individuals and people. So I still do practice part-time as a pelvic health physical therapist. And for those of your listeners who might not know, pelvic PTs specialize in not just the pelvis, but a lot of things related to our pelvic health, like bladder, bowel, sexual health, reproductive wellness, pelvic pain concerns, and concerns in the area, like hips, low back, the whole shebang. And it was through that work that I got really more and more interested in the specific issues facing female health and queer health in the United States and abroad. I have a lot of the lens locally in the US, but I am also pretty tuned into global issues as well and how they differ from country to country and how some of these marginalized populations face really unique health challenges. And that's what drew me into working in writing and consulting for health tech companies. I worked for a health tech startup for a couple years as an employee, as a clinician
Okay.
through their telehealth platform. And I really saw some of the problems facing the industry and how there was a really big need to combine both the interest in developing tech that would work for people and increase access to care, but making sure that it's scientifically backed by research and all this nerdy stuff that I love to write about that you've so warmly complimented. So that's kind of how I ended up where I am today. A long circuitous journey, but
No, I love it. And it sounds like you're in exactly the right place for you because it does combine all of these areas of interest. And you know what's so great about modern technology and where we're going in many ways. What I like about modern technology is it allows us to kind of combine all of those areas of interest and all those areas of expertise into
yeah,
one kind of cohesive career fit, that
exactly.
maybe incorporates a lot of parts. Sorry, I'm really moving today.
No, it's all good. It's what happens when multi-passionate people get together and talk about their many passions. So
Exactly.
I
We
love
have a
it.
lot of movement. And
Yes,
just really quickly, want to stay on the physical therapy part for 1 second.
sure.
I, prior to getting involved in anything related to do with FemTech, I really didn't even know there you could have a pelvic physical therapist. How do people get
Totally.
referred to you? How do people find these people in their lives?
You
Is it
are
true?
not the only one. Definitely
Okay.
not. That doesn't know who we are or what we do. The specialty within PT is becoming more and more well known. And there's, I think, and we have to give some credit to all the influencers and social media for making it um, more obvious to the general public that it's an option. But so many people are in the same place that you are. They don't know that it is a treatment type until they need it, until they're running into a problem. So more clinicians, especially primary care doctors and gynecologists and urologists, have become aware of our work and do refer people to us. But a lot of pelvic health PTs, myself included, market directly to the public as well because their clinicians may not know about us if they're just not as up to date on the literature, or they just might not be recommended to come to see a pelvic health PT because people assume maybe that all we can do is help with bladder leakage, which is one thing we can definitely help with, but it's not the only symptom or concern. So I think
Okay.
it's a mix. I think people find us through us marketing ourselves, through referrals from clinicians who are really on top of the research, and then also from Googling, because a lot of people are like, does it feel like my vagina is falling out of my body? And then
Yeah.
they learn about pelvic organ prolapse, and then they realize, oh, there's someone I can see for that. So it's a
Yes,
mix.
I actually only learned about I guess well when I read about it, it sounded like it was pelvic floor prolapse. Is that what you just said too?
The technical term is pelvic organ prolapse, where the
Okay.
organs are descending through the vaginal canal. Yeah.
So somebody might have said floor, right?
Yeah, they might have for sure. Yep.
It was a woman on Facebook that I'm friendly with. She posted years ago, like, this just happened to me.
Hmm.
This is like you'll never believe it, but this is a thing. And it was the
Yep.
first time I even heard about this. So if that's
Exactly.
a problem, somebody can refer themselves, but they might not
Hmm.
even know what it's called when they're having the problem.
Exactly. Definitely. So for those situations, I tell people one of our magical powers, I think, as pelvic health PTs, is we're not afraid of any of these taboo topics. We talk about pee, poop, and sex for a living, so you cannot embarrass us, and you definitely cannot surprise us. We've heard it all. So if you think it is something going on with vaginal health, bladder, bowel, sexual function, even these things that are hard to talk about and maybe hard to ask people, chances are a pelvic health PT probably knows how to treat it or knows how to get you to someone that can treat
That just goes, it's swimmingly into our first actual
it.
question that I have for you, which
Totally.
is the idea of these taboos. So topics like
Yeah.
this, it's so interesting. So I'm 50, and so my generation, it's every generation's getting better and better, I think, about opening up about these topics. And my
Definitely.
daughter's 15, and you hear what goes on, and it's a whole different world than I was
Yeah.
raised in. And then for my mom, who's 75, it's a whole, each generation is becoming better and better at embracing these topics that were previously taboo, but really important.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
what strategies do you use to break down these barriers and make these conversations not just engaging because they are, but accessible and make people comfortable having them? Because even though you might
Totally.
be comfortable talking about poop, not everybody is. It's like the conversation we have with our toddlers and then we stop talking about it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really great point, and I love that you recognize how the general pattern in society is changing, thankfully. But we still have a lot of work to do, and it is really dependent on someone's socioeconomic status and their education and maybe the political environment in which they grew up. How open was their family or not? Their religious background, if they have one. So it is super variable, even within individual generations. For me, what I've found in my professional life, both as a clinician and as a consultant and writer in this space, the more true I am to myself, the better my message comes across. And I'm a very open person, and I recognize that there's a lot of people that feel more closed off about these issues. But I know that if I act awkward or uncomfortable or don't speak openly about the issues, that clearly comes across as inauthentic to the person I'm speaking with. So I have to start from where I'm comfortable, which is being open and just saying the word vagina like it's no big deal, because it is no big deal. That said, I have to balance that with the person in front of me. I tend to use humor a lot because I think for many of us, if we can laugh about it, it's less scary, right? And I find when I'm speaking to, for example, a person who's a patient and is feeling really vulnerable sitting in a room with me for the first time, if I can get a little giggle or at least a smile out in the first couple minutes, you can just see the tension melt away. And the same thing happens when I'm speaking with a client in health tech, and maybe there's something that they're not feeling as comfortable talking about or don't know how to approach me or how I'm going to react. So humor is a really powerful tool, but I have to balance it with the seriousness of the issues that we're talking about. Okay. Some people are not going to respond well to that. A really great example, one of my current clients is we're working in the cancer space, the gynecologic cancer survivorship, and creating a medical device in that space. That's a really heavy topic. And it comes with a lot of really complicated symptoms. Painful sex is a big one. That's a side effect of cancer treatment. And that's emotionally loaded for so many people. So yeah, I can bring humor in a little bit, but I have to temper that with some acknowledgement of this sucks. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you have to deal with this. This is really heavy, and meet that person where they are with their energy when we're discussing it. And that makes it a lot easier to open up the conversation. When I'm talking to a bigger audience, though, like on social media, I don't know that individual person who's reading my post or watching my video. So that's where I come back to being authentic to me, which is open, usually a little bit of humor, and a lot of data and research to back up what I'm saying.
It's funny you're saying this because I do think I'm thinking about your posts. Obviously, I'm not your patient. I've not been in these spaces, but your post, you do use humor and you do use data. And I notice an absence of, even though I can tell you are, outrage. So you're really good about presenting something in a non-loaded way and just presenting the facts and letting people kind of take the information and sit with it on their own instead of saying, hey,
I'm
I have a
pissed.
tendency to be like furious all the time.
Yeah, totally.
So I really appreciate that you are able to, I feel like maybe that comes with your training, maybe it's part of who you are, I don't know, but you're really able to do that in a way that doesn't, incite incite fury or outrage. People basically, instead of just being frustrated with the maybe kind of lack of research in women's health, which obviously is frustrating, you're also giving them something to take away that they can do themselves, which I think is really helpful, because if you're just outraged, that's where you're leaning instead of,
Totally.
do you know what I'm talking about?
Totally. I'm so glad to hear that that comes through, Danielle, because that's something I'm always concerned about. And I know you and I have had conversations before where we're both just like, God, I'm so angry about
Yeah.
this. And we can say that to each other in conversation. But when I'm working to educate people in my professional platforms, I know I have to temper that a little bit to avoid exactly what you're saying. Because I mean, rage bait is such a thing online now, right? Like it's so easy to get clicks with a really intense or really provocative headline. But if you don't offer anything to follow that up, you just leave people angry. And that doesn't make change, right? That doesn't inspire people to make a next step or learn more or open up a discussion. And it's really funny that you bring that up now, because this past month, I've been really focusing a lot of my writing work around the issue of abortion medicine and reproductive rights and planning. And it's obviously a super loaded issue, especially in the States right now. And this is the first time that I'm actually getting a lot of trolls commenting on my work, which on LinkedIn, I hadn't really experienced before, because it is maybe more of a professional platform. And I think people censor themselves a little more. It's not anonymous, it's a little more clear who you are if you're posting these things. But that's changing. So it's been something I've had to really work on and kind of self-edit and let myself feel the anger and the frustration, because good God, do I feel it. But then taking that and making it something actionable and making a choice to edit what I'm talking about and reframe it so that we can actually have a productive discussion around it. So that's always my goal.
Yeah, and that's actually the next thing I wanted to ask you. You've been vocal about shortcomings in women's and LGBTQ plus healthcare. So what inspired you? I know you're research based and you've got this clinical side, but and thing is, you're busy, you've got a lot of work to do, but what inspired you to take this beyond clinical work into public discourse?
Yeah, totally. Several things. I think the clinical experience of working with individual people inspired a lot of the empathy behind what I do. It sounds cliche, but I really consider myself an empath. And that way, I mean, when someone's sitting in front of me talking about pain or a really embarrassing or debilitating problem that they have, I tend to internalize it a lot and feel it a lot inside. And I take some of that home with me. From a clinician standpoint, any clinician will tell you that's not the best pattern because that leads to burnout, which is very, very real. But a lot of people in my space have that characteristic, and that's what gets us into caring professions in the beginning and to begin with, right? So that is where I first kind of identified with so many of these barriers and seeing the problems people had accessing care, and how many folks like you who maybe had a couple kids but never even knew so many of these problems could result from childbirth, for example, or were entering perimenopause and no one has spoken to them about that transition and what they can do to manage it. People who are highly educated, intelligent people who just don't have any of the information. And then additionally, folks who lack that education, who don't have access to a lot of training, who maybe have language barriers, economic barriers that are preventing them from getting the care they need. So I saw all sorts in the clinic, and I still do. And that always, having that human face on it for me always reminds me of the humanity of these barriers and how they affect individuals. So writing for me started as a way to process a lot of that, as a way to kind of bring home some of that heaviness that I was feeling and get it out of here and process it more, as well as share it with other people. And I've always been really interested in advocacy work and have been involved in it since I was an undergrad. So finding a way to dovetail the two, my personal experiences that I was processing and all the data that was building up behind that with something that could actually make a change and help people transform the problem and make it better. That's really what I wanted to find. And that's where I focused all of my work since then. And it's an ongoing challenge that I like to get up and work on every day. So I'm lucky.
I love how you've chosen to kind of diffuse those feelings or kind of like temper them. I think it's a great idea. And I do want to say, I don't want to sidetrack my own self, but I have to comment. You mentioned, that's not always great to be so empathetic as a clinician. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because, like, obviously all career paths all over the world seem to have been originated by men. And so we walk into them as women and we're told, oh, well, this one, you're not supposed to care too much. And as somebody who used to be in politics, I used to hear that a lot. Like, oh, I think you might be too emotional for this. You might care too much. And I'm like, if I didn't care, I wouldn't be involved. And also, I think we need to flip the script on that and say, I think people need to care a little more, because it's not just this like analytical stuff. It is, there are emotions tied to things, and that is okay. Like, it's okay to have a human reaction. So thank you for having that. Could you share your perspective on some of the issues that are facing the communities that you're dealing with today, and talk about what kind of changes you would like to see to improve healthcare outcomes? And it's one of the things that obviously you and I know that now audiences everywhere will know you had been talking about lack of research. I can't remember why I sent you this specific article, but we talked about the idea that there were like almost no studies at all ever in the world on the clitoris. And so there's a Dr. Rachel Rubin who's known as the clitorologist, because she's literally like the only doctor that studies it. And that seems like such a preposterous, it almost seems like it's a joke, which is why I'm laughing, but it's real. So what are some of the issues that you are seeing that you find to be the most pressing one? And maybe that's not it. I just threw it out there as something, because we are, for those who don't know, women have not been included in research studies historically. And so there's a lot of information we don't have about our own bodies.
Yeah, totally. And that's such a great question. Thank you for raising it, Danielle, because that particular statistic too has become more well known, at least in the women's health space recently. But I think it bears repeating that if you were born before 1993, you have been alive longer than women were required to be in clinical trials in the United States. So that includes both you and I. And it's just mind-blowing. I feel old, but that makes me feel old. Holy smokes. So that there's more and more push to rectify that. So in 2016, the NIH pushed through an initiative that started to emphasize the need for researching sex as a biological variable. It's abbreviated SABV. So if you see that somewhere, that stands for studying sex as a biological variable. And just to be clear on the definition, I think we often interchangeably use sex and gender as the same word in modern discourse, but they are not the same thing. When we're talking about sex as a biological variable, we're talking about the direct impact of sex chromosomes, XY, XX, XXY, whatever someone's particular variant is, and how those chromosomes and the genes that they control and encode affect their outcomes in health. And it's very complicated. Genetics gets real hairy, so I don't want to get down the rabbit hole too far. But there's been more push in that area to initiate the way we look at data from that lens, from independently separating out male and female study participants, for example, and maybe those few that might fall more on the intersex spectrum, and looking at their outcomes differently. So that's progress, which is great. But that was initiated in 2016, within less than a decade, hard to believe. And it still hasn't been fully rolled out. Not all studies are doing a great job of adhering to the NIH's recommendation in that regard. So that's where we continue to need advocacy. We continue to need to remind people that there's a really specific reason why we want to look at data specifically based on one's biological sex and how that might affect their health. Okay. And this applies across the spectrum. I think about this a lot in the lens of the queer community and someone who might be gender non-conforming or gender fluid and might not identify as a woman, for example, but that person still needs to get breast cancer screening, for example. They still might need to get cervical cancer screening. And those populations often are not educated that they need to continue to get that care because of their innate biological predisposition to problems in that area. We also know that population is more predisposed to having adverse health outcomes because of various social determinants, discrimination, fear about going to the doctor because they might be discriminated against, et cetera. Okay. But thinking about how sex affects health outcomes is critical, continuing to research that and push for research and funding in that area. That's huge. That dovetails into my second point, which I think it's really important that we continue to recognize that we are not in a post-gender world. I identify very strongly as a feminist, and I think when people hear me say that, they think, oh, she hates men. She's just a crazy bra-burning, she's going to cause trouble. She's going to make any conversation really difficult, and she's going to stomp on everything that I say, blah, 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 right? That is not who I am. And that is not the modern definition of feminism. The modern definition of feminism is really using gender and sex as a lens to look at culture and make culture more inclusive for all of us, because the patriarchy really hurts everyone. Very cisgender, male-presenting people included. It hurts all of us. And I think that there's a lot of push in society right now that, oh, well, we're past that. We don't need feminism anymore. If you want to be equal, you don't need to be pulled out and looked at separately. We don't need to study you differently. You want to be equal. Why don't we just study everyone as a group? Why don't we treat everyone exactly the same? There's a difference between equality and equity. And we can get into that if that's helpful in the definitions. But I think it's critical that we remember, given how recent so many of these changes are in the way we study, in the way we look at medical problems, and the way we research health, we are just barely scratching the surface. And we need to continue to push for a very specific lens on the way that we treat people medically and the way that we research people medically without creating discrimination, but instead promoting more equity and promoting more tailored ways of caring for people based on their own predispositions and their makeup as a human being. I hope
Yes.
that makes sense. That was a lot.
It does, because, and it also blows my mind that anybody would push back against this. And I understand that, like, for clinical studies, obviously there's a lot of work that goes into it that I will never
Totally.
comprehend. So I get that people might push back, because anytime somebody has more work to do, they tend to push back.
They don't like it.
So, right, nobody wants to be told how to do their job. But
Yes.
the thing is, it's so obvious. I mean, if the female, and I'm going to mess you up in terms of,
Not at all. Not at all.
but if
Use your words the
women
way you use them.
if women are pushing out children, that affects I would imagine that affects all our organs, right? That
Totally.
affects our body. I mean, I remember having my son, and my ankles, as I had him, and I had IV treatment at the time. We both
Mm,
developed fevers. It was not a big deal, but I remember my ankles were just so humongous. And it's
yep.
like, these are things that people who've had children will say, oh yeah, that happens.
That's
But you
normal.
don't know, you have no preparation. You don't
Totally.
understand how childbirth is going to affect different parts of your body, and forget
Yep.
just your body, how it's going to affect your emotions, your mental health.
Exactly.
It's a huge thing. Just that aspect alone seems like, why would
Hmm.
we not be studying people differently? And
Yep.
also, isn't that what we want from all things? I mean, isn't individualism or individual treatment what we want out of
Yeah.
education, medicine? I get that there's like a common denominator, and there needs to be, right?
Totally.
Everybody needs to learn these certain things, and everybody needs to be treated in a certain way. So we everybody might need blood tests, and everybody might need this. But from there, do we not just establish that as a baseline? Is that not just,
Exactly.
we should say, not that's the worst we can do, and
Yeah.
go from there, not say that's
Exactly.
the best we can do? It blows my mind that there's pushback.
Totally. And I think that's a really great point. So obviously there's there's a culture war going on in the United States, and I think all of us are aware of that. And that's its own issue when it comes to speaking about these concerns. But even if we take a step back and look at why haven't we been studying women? Why haven't we been studying people that aren't even on the gender binary spectrum? Why haven't we been looking at this? And specifically, if we think about people with uteruses, this is a really salient example of why some of this happened that might help people understand and feel a little less inflamed, maybe, about the issue. I always try to remind myself. And the initial reason that we stopped including women in clinical trials in the United States was intended from a place of good. And it arose from the thalidomide scandals in the middle of the 20th century, when women were receiving this medication called thalidomide to help with morning sickness, theoretically. And it actually ended up causing tons and tons of really advanced and really extreme congenital deformities in the children that they were carrying. And some of them died. Some of them were born missing, like skulls, for example,
Oh
really
my
severe.
gosh.
So then everyone panicked and thought, oh my God, we cannot be using any medication in pregnancy or in people that are trying to become pregnant. We can't do anything because we have no idea what it'll do to the babies. So there was sweeping legislation that went through and said, well, if you're of childbearing age, regardless of whether or not you want to have children, we don't get to include you because you might get pregnant and then the baby could get screwed up. Again, came from a place of trying to be protective, but ended up
Right.
being very, very a negative outcome for the population. So the other thing, even now, you think, all right, well, we know that we're past that point. We should know better now. We can experiment safely. We can conduct trials in such a way that aren't going to harm babies or aren't going to harm potentially pregnant people. But think about this consideration. When NIH was releasing this movement to try to get sex as a biological variable into research more, some scientists pushed back because they felt that even animal models, like female mice, for example, would skew their data because females were inherently more complicated, because theoretically, our body temperature fluctuates too significantly during our menstrual cycle, and that could mess up the way that their data comes out and make it less clean. Turns out that that's been disproven. Our body temperature does not fluctuate substantially enough to affect that kind of data, but that was the predominant idea at the time. And that's what caused many scientists, even well-intentioned ones, to choose male mice or male human subjects, participants for their studies. So there's a lot of baggage behind why this happens, but that's the continued battle. We have to disabuse people of these notions so we can figure out, all right, It's not as complicated as we think. And even if it is complicated, it's critical that we do this work.
I was just going to say, so what's the answer? And you just said it because, right, it may be more complicated. And I'm not,
Sometimes.
I mean, yes, I can see why it would be more complicated, especially
Yeah.
with the example that you gave about the pregnancy. And that's like such a huge issue, but it doesn't mean we abandon ship. It means we have to
Exactly.
reduce our sales. So
Exactly. Yes.
I gotcha.
It's a great
Well,
analogy.
and I thank you. I try. Well, and I think it's interesting too. I was saying, what role do you think individuals like yourself, clinicians, consultants, and advocates play in shaping the future of public health for women and LGBTQ plus communities? But also some don't necessarily. I feel like you do, especially because you are willing to educate while you're practicing and while you're doing your work. So I just was curious, like, how do you in particular hope to shape the future of these communities? If that's not
Really
too
good
big of a
question.
question.
No, it's a great question. And there's a lot to it. And I think it's going to be different for different people. But for me, education and advocacy is just it builds me back up. It feeds me. So it doesn't usually feel like a chore or an additional step. Of course, there are times when I have a really busy schedule and have a heavy clinical load and several clients for my business all needing things at the same time. And it feels like a lot. But one thing I always come back to is how much I enjoy digging into the research and then getting to translate it into normal English for people. That's, I think, one of my strongest skill sets. So for me, it feels like nourishment. So I'm lucky in that regard. It might not for everyone, but regardless of our leanings, whether it's someone like me who is nourished from this type of work or someone that doesn't respond to that kind of work but wants to have an impact, there's still ways that we can do it. Whether we're clinicians, whether we're women's health advocates without a clinical background, whether we're a founder building a startup for women, whatever it is, we have a really important duty in these spaces when we're educating the public, regardless of our lens that we're coming from. If we are in a place of even small amount of power and that we have a platform like a podcast or a following on social media, that we need to make sure that the information we're giving to women and to more marginalized populations or subpopulations is backed by fact. There is so much nonsense out there, and you're involved, you see it all the time. There's misinformation and disinformation. I think about them as two separate animals. I think of misinformation as people making honest mistakes in not necessarily reading the details of research that they're reporting on, or not necessarily digging in to see how applicable what they're talking about is to multiple populations. They're just trying to get info out there and be as helpful as they can, but miss something along the way. Versus disinformation, which is how I see it as deliberate, malignant manipulation of fact to serve a political end, a personal end, a social end, whatever it is. Regardless, both are out there, both are rampant, and the more connected our world becomes on the internet and social media and various other ways, the more those concerns are going to spread, that mis and disinformation. So as people that have platforms for education and have lots of education ourselves and the ability to analyze data and explain it to others, we have an obligation to do that as clearly as we can and as often as we can to help people weed through the nonsense and the mess. And then I think my other point would be that for clinicians especially, there's a desperate need for clinicians and scientists in the health tech and innovation space. And we can talk about this more if it's relevant, but one thing I often see is a mentality that healthcare providers and technical innovators are diametrically opposed and have opposite goals and will never get along. And I don't think that that's true or that it has to be true. The biggest problem is that people view often healthcare providers as very cautious, which we are trained to be, obviously, because we are holding human lives in our hands and human well-being in our hands, right? And people view tech innovators as very move fast, break things, make it work, figure it out on the way as you're building the ship, right? And to me, those two opposing approaches are actually made for each other because they counter each other out. And that's how you push forward a product that is innovative, but also safe and helpful and productive. So I think finding better ways for us to work together as an ecosystem rather than seeing each other as enemies or as contradictory to each other is going to be critical to making sure that new products coming out onto the market are doing what they promise or doing what we hope they do for patients and for users in general.
It's funny too, because, I went to a FemTech conference in June, and it was great.
Yeah.
It was such an excellent experience, and I learned so much and met really amazing people. But one of the things I noticed is that there were a lot of people there in the investor space because they're investing in these products, and the people who
Yes.
are developing the products obviously need the investors. I mean, it's
Yes.
a symbiotic relationship. Whereas medical professionals, a lot of times, like that is not they're not, I'm generalizing and I don't know if I'm
You're
correct, but I
no, you're correct.
think that while they may work for hospital systems and they may have to deal with kind of the system there that and insurance and financial aspects of their practice, they're
Yes.
not catering to investors and they are
Correct.
not having to embody that space. So for them,
Correct.
it might feel a little bit like, oh, this is not what we do. We work with the people. We took the Hippocratic Oath, whether that's do no harm, and we're going to be cautious about it because of that. Whereas,
Right.
so it does seem like it would be kind of a tough, although it innately makes sense to me why they are working together, it does seem like it would be a tough thing for people who've been in these fields for a long time, especially, the
Yeah,
longer you do something, the more stuck you are in the way that you do it. So for
totally.
people who've been in this for a long time to kind of come together, do you have any ideas or suggestions, or do you see it work in some
Yeah,
places better
that's
than others?
such a keen insight, Danielle. Yeah, I definitely do. And I have a great anecdote from a company that I used to work for. And I was speaking with a colleague who was also a clinician herself. She was the only one on the product team. So she was the only one working directly with the engineers and the other tech folks to create the product for the patient. And she asked for help.
Wow.
She's like, I need another clinician on this team to help me with my workload. I have too much. And her colleagues, her non-clinical colleagues on the team told her, oh, we don't want to hire another clinician. You guys are too detail-oriented and difficult to work with. That was the feedback she got. And I was taken aback by that. Now, there are valid points, I think, on both ends of the spectrum in that, yes, some clinicians can be very stuck in their ways and are inherently distrustful of technology and of anybody who's non-clinical coming in and telling them things. I think gosh, the recent events in healthcare with United Healthcare CEO being assassinated really talks to us about like how much distrust there is in from the general public around non-medical people interfering in medicine and how much medical professionals hate non-medical people interfering in medicine. But the truth is we need different brains with different training to work in the modern world and to solve the types of problems that we face. The average surgeon does not have the engineering capability to create a new surgical robot, for example. That surgeon needs to work with engineers to create something that fixes their problem and helps them treat patients better. We cannot live in silos anymore. So this is the exact type of gap that I'm trying to bridge in my own work. Now, I'm just one person, but because I've been in both spheres, I've been in healthcare, I've been an employee in health tech, I've been a freelance consultant in health tech, I've been in all of these different places. I can see the bigger picture a little bit more broadly, I think, than colleagues who have not. And that's where I'm trying to bring folks together to say, okay, I'm going to bring the clinical insight, I'm going to bring the research and the data, and then we're going to figure out how to together we can make this work for your goals. How can we make your product as good as it can possibly be and as effective as it can possibly be? So we're not settling for, I think the term you used earlier was the worst possible, the lowest bar, right? We're always, even if the first iteration isn't perfect, how can we make it good enough that it is safe and will do what it says, and then have plans to make it better as we show its effectiveness. So I think comes from a lot of helping clinicians understand the needs of investors and founders, and helping founders understand why they need clinicians and scientists on their team in addition to their technical folks and their business companions and their investors, why we need a really diverse workforce to create a product that actually makes a difference in people's health.
And it's interesting because I guess, where we are, we're almost at 2025. This is
Mhm.
really the first. I mean, I'm sure it's been headed this way for a long time, but it seems
Yeah.
like more than ever, we do need to find these collaborations because your example
Mhm.
is so great. Like, obviously, a surgeon is not going to, I mean, maybe some surgeon has double skill
Occasionally.
set, but for the most part, I would imagine most surgeons don't have the skill set to then develop the
Yes,
computerized, like the robot that's going to do, but likewise, the engineer doesn't have the surgical skill. They're not going to know.
exactly.
You really do need to collaborate. Wow.
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
really thank you. I like this. Okay. All right. So that's what so tell me, what are your hopes for the future of femtech and queer health
Mhm.
tech? Is this
Yeah.
what I mean, is that your hope that we come together to do these things, or do you have specific things in mind when in terms of
Mhm.
what needs to happen to ensure these industries fulfill their potential to serve patients first?
Totally. Yeah, I definitely do. I think decreasing that tension between the two supposedly opposing sides will be a big step forward in making progress in this industry, particularly in health tech. But I'd also really just love to see a continued dedication to making sure that the products that are rolling out quickly, because I understand the ecosystem. I understand you need to roll out a minimum viable product, excuse me, to get investors. And then you can take that investment money to make the product better. We get it. It's an iterative process. But we need to make sure that the products that are developing on the market are what people need and want, of course. So they're going to buy them or use them, and that they're going to be effective. 2 points on this. I cannot tell you how many times I've had someone come in as a patient and tell me, well, I tried XYZ in product and none of them worked for me at home. So I don't know if there's any hope for me. Well, there's hope for that person. They just were using the wrong tool or they weren't using it in the right way. So there's nothing that's going to make patients or other users more frustrated and give up hope quicker than trying one or two products that give them no progress or even worse, make their problems more severe, right? In women's health, especially, and in sexual health, and in more of these quote unquote taboo areas, we may only have one shot to help someone get better and to catch them before they lose hope or just give up. So we need to make sure that that shot we give them is a good one that's going to work and is not just a band-aid. So that's one. The second point is that, oh gosh, that we have a very human-centered approach to what we're designing. I wrote a LinkedIn post recently about a couple products that came out some years ago. One of them was a pillow that you stick between your breasts at night to prevent them from getting wrinkly, so you don't wake up with breast wrinkles in the morning. Who asks for this?
And I was like, this is a
Did anybody need this? Another was a product designed by a German company, headed by, unsurprisingly, three men who designed a vine. I don't even know if they designed it. They had a bright pink latex glove that you could use to remove tampons to avoid mess with menstrual products. And their marketing was centered around, ew, periods are gross, decrease the yuck, essentially, which is problematic on many fronts. But clearly, they didn't speak to
how
their
did it
users. They didn't.
sell?
I
Did
I don't. I
Okay.
it closed quickly.
Okay.
There was
Okay.
a
I
lot of
was
public outroar, so I don't think it even had time to sell. Uh, but clearly they didn't research. They didn't realize that this is not what menstruators are looking for right now, right? And we also don't want to create more stigma around menstruation. So understanding what women and queer folks really need, what they're missing right now, and what their healthcare providers need. Talking to all those stakeholders before developing a product all the way to the end. You might have a really good idea as a founder, for example, or think it's a good idea, but realize, ooh, not in this exact form that I envisioned. Maybe if I tweak it, it'll be exactly what my providers or what my potential audience need. So involving all those stakeholders from patient and the people who care for them can really help to make sure the products that are getting to market are valuable, aren't going to increase stigma, and are actually going to work. And then the last point I'll make on this is I think we really have an and I truly believe we have an ethical responsibility in this particular space, because we're talking about health. We're talking about probably one of the most valuable intangibles in our lives. They always say health is wealth, right? You hear that cliche, and it's not wrong. Anyone who's struggled with a chronic illness or a debilitating injury can tell you when you don't have your full health, the rest of life is harder. And I always encourage folks, especially those who maybe haven't been in medicine or haven't worked with people face to face, even in another field, if you are not going to recommend your product wholeheartedly to your mom, to your sister, to your little cousin, to your daughter, whoever it is, if you can't envision that person's face in front of you and say you would recommend that product to them without reservation, that product does not belong on the market. It is not ready. It is not good enough yet. And you need to work to make it better before you start selling it to other people who maybe you don't know, because that person is someone else's mom, someone else's sister, etc. So
I have a
that's my
question.
hope.
I know this is totally a generalization, but do you ever feel that, I mean, are you, you mentioned the period glove,
Yes.
and I don't know what else to call it, the yuck
Yes.
glove. Um,
Yep.
so, and it was developed by men, and,
Mhm.
and I would not presume to really know what my husband or son might need. And sometimes I find these things shocking. Somebody will be like, "Well, I
Yeah.
really need this." And I'm like, "Get the heck out of here." Like, great. It never occurred to me. But do you find,
Totally.
I mean, is it a generalization that women are creating products that women need? Because I find,
Mhm.
I feel like I talk about this in every podcast episode, and I'm really going to have to temper that. It can't be said enough. I used to be part of a mom, it was called Moms Running. So we talked to a lot of moms, and we talked to a lot of women who ran for office. And a lot of times what they would say, the differences, and Tammy Duckworth specifically said this to me, was that, a lot of times men will say, I woke up and I looked in the mirror and I thought I would be a great president. And I'm not knocking them. That's
Mhm.
a whole different, it is a whole different world for a man in the country, and I'm not knocking
It
them.
is. Yeah.
I don't know what those challenges are, because
Right.
I'm not a man, and I don't know how a man
Totally.
comes to this decision. But I will say that that for me and for the women that I've spoken to, and she pointed this out, that it was from her perspective as well. A lot of times you find yourself running for office not because you want to. In fact, many times
Mhm.
you don't want to, but you feel that there is a problem that needs to be solved. And
Yeah.
I feel like it's the same way I've noticed with a lot of women that I've spoken to in advocacy or FemTech.
Mhm.
They're speaking up not because they feel like doing this. A lot of times they
Yeah.
had jobs that they were successful in, there were fields that they were interested in, but they
Mhm.
realized, hey, I see this problem and nobody's fixing it, so I'm gonna throw my hat in the ring here to do my best to get it solved. Are you
Exactly.
seeing that some of the products that are coming out are more effective? I mean, your personal, obviously, we're not
Mhm.
doing a study here on this, but your
Right.
personal response, do you feel like they're more created by women? I want to say women centric, but
Yeah.
obviously, I mean, are you seeing that products for women are best created by women?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think there's a reason why 70% of founders in femtech are female. And that's way higher than the founder ratio in startups in general outside of femtech. I don't remember what the number is in non-female health companies, but it is like orders of magnitude higher. And you're right, many of those founders, this is why I love working in this space, because many of the founders are inspired by their own struggles or the struggles of a loved one. And that's what gets them into this role that they never expected to be in, just like someone running for office because they felt like they had to solve the problem because it was driving them crazy. And those are often the most motivated people too. And they're great to work with because they're so passionate about what they're doing. And that's, of course, like you said, this is not to say that there are many amazing male advocates out there that are really interested in this research and this work. And one of the companies, the cancer organization I was speaking with in gynecologic cancer, our CEO is a male. He's fantastic. He's an OBGYN. He understands a lot of these issues from his professional experience and from being a dad and living with his wife. Right? He has interesting insights. But if you're not involving people with that lived experience on your team too, you're missing
Right.
something. And my lived experience is not the same as your lived experiences, is not the same as my father's lived experiences or my partner's, right? We have to involve people with the skills and people with the lived experiences and bring them together to create the best product. And many times women are designing these amazing new products because they're solving a problem for themselves. And then it becomes a bigger company and a bigger product from there. Yeah.
I love that part about, I love that aspect of it. And I was going to ask you, and this is totally putting you on the spot, so
All
I can
good.
edit this out. Do you have any products that or devices or apps that have struck you lately as like really being on the right track?
Oh yeah. Oh
Especially
gosh.
because we're talking about, unfortunately, there. Do you know Rachel Honeyman? Do you know her from
Yes.
LinkedIn? I
Yes.
interviewed her a few weeks ago because not only is she a copywriter, but she also treats women in self-defense,
Oh,
and which
cool.
I
Okay.
find to be so interesting. And she was talking about, she's like, a lot of people, and it's the misguided thing again,
Yeah.
misinformation. A lot of people share information, but unfortunately, it's stuff that's going to get you even more physically hurt.
Hurt.
And
Hmm.
and when we're talking about physical pain and physical
Hmm.
repercussions like we're talking about in health,
Yeah.
it you should it's easy to identify when something's very wrong. Do you
Yeah.
have any recommendations for just things that you've seen that you think, these people are on the right track?
Are very right. Oh yeah, totally. Happy to share a few. I love geeking out about this stuff. I'll preface it by saying I'm not sponsored by any of these brands. I don't have a financial relationship with any of these brands or devices. They're just devices that I think are really cool and very effective, and I've seen them work in myself or other people. Um, I love the company, the Pelvic people. They were formerly called O Nut, but they have two key products now. One is their original O Nut, which is a series of stackable silicone rings that folks who deal with painful penetration during intercourse can use to create a buffer if their partner is male or if they're using dildos for penetration.
Huh.
And these can decrease the depth of penetration in a way that's comfortable for both partners and decrease pain and fear around sex. And they also somewhat recently released a second product that's focused for people with pain with initial penetration. So depth isn't their problem, but they have a lot of pain with initial insertion during sex. So they have another product called the Kiwi, which is designed to help with that. And they're approaching their work from a very kind of biopsychosocial aspect because not only are they selling these products, but they're also offering education. They have an online, what they call their pelvic gym, to teach people about pelvic floor tightness and trauma and PTSD and all these other things that can impact the pain experience, especially pain around sex. So they're taking a really holistic view. So I love their work.
Wow.
Um, I'm working with another company too that is just getting ready to launch. Actually, they're really, really in their infancy. But this company is called Ladybug, Ladi Bug. And the co-founders are working to create an e-commerce platform that is specific for women's products, for female health products across a whole range of conditions, like menstrual products, pregnancy, postpartum, fertility, menopause, bone health, the whole nine yards. And what they're really focused on is making sure all their products are vetted properly by a medical advisory board. They're prioritizing products that are perhaps FDA cleared or FDA approved, that have undergone rigorous third-party testing for quality. For example, anything you might ingest. They're steering clear of things that might be a little more hokey and don't have a lot of evidence yet to back them up, because some of those could be potentially harmful, and if not harmful, maybe ineffective. So they're really trying to create a trusted platform that isn't the Amazon of of women's health products, but is a more curated library where women can go and find things that they can trust with research backing for them. So I love that idea that's still coming to fruition. It's still in progress.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's
Especially
a
because
really cool.
yeah, and it speaks to what you said, when it's a product that's ineffective or worse, actually bad, but let's just say
Totally.
it's ineffective, you might lose people who that was their only time they were going to look. So
Exactly.
this way, everything's already vetted. You've got a much better chance. I mean, I know not
Totally.
everything's going to work for everybody, but
Exactly.
that probably helps limit the field.
Exactly. And like we were talking about earlier, some people you only have one or two chances, and if you mess up, they're never going to look for help again, and they may be suffering in silence for the rest of their life with their condition. So that's super important. The last couple just two more companies I want to mention. Lhasa Health is doing really amazing work in the endometriosis space in trying to help create a digital platform for both providers and patients to make the process of diagnosing endometriosis and other chronic pelvic pain conditions eventually smoother. Because right now, the average woman goes 7 to 10 years before she receives an endo diagnosis, and it's a really debilitating condition that can take away a lot of years and a lot of quality of life years from someone's life. And then telehealth is doing really cool work in the space of pelvic floor health education. So they're really focused on the pelvis and what do our pelvic floor muscles do for us. This is my world, 100%. And there's not nearly enough information out there for the people that I work with clinically. And I see people coming back confused with questions. No matter how hard people like me try to teach patients and try to empower patients, they need more reinforcement. Most people understand and remember maybe half of what a doctor tells them in a given medical appointment. So having some other sort of reinforcement and a trusted educational platform for that information is going to be really huge so that people aren't resorting to, influencers on TikTok to get all of their medical training and their medical information. So those are a few. I could go on. There's so many cool products in this space, but those are a few of my favorites.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. I could talk
Yeah,
to you all day, but I will
same.
I will not make you sit through this. But I really appreciate your insights into this. And I feel like I mean, obviously you have to keep up what you're doing because it's so beneficial, I think, for the people who are out there, reading what you post, obviously what you do in your professional life, but also the fact that you go ahead and you share this educational information is very beneficial, and I appreciate it. I'm going to link back to Caitlin and her website and also her LinkedIn space. Well, I'll do all her socials, but particularly I'm going to pull out a couple links to some specific posts so people
Awesome.
can read them and see exactly what we're talking about. I should have started with a post. I should have done a post, and I didn't think to do that.
All good. Thank you for
But thank
linking.
you so much for your time. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it, and yeah, and we'll be in touch soon. But thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for your time and your keen questions as well, Danielle. Really appreciate
You're the best. All right. Have a great day. Thank you.
it. Bye.